Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive today on the Russia-Ukraine war. We're going to go deep, really try to understand this whole situation. Whether you're getting ready for some meeting, you're just trying to understand the news, or just kind of fascinated by it all. We're going to try to unpack it.
Yeah, it's a long story.
That's what I was thinking, like how far back do we even have to go to understand this?
Well, to understand the current conflict, we really have to look at Ukraine's position.
Yeah.
You know, for centuries, it was part of the Russian Empire, then later on, obviously, the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of shared history.
Huh?
Families, languages, culture, all intertwined. And even after Ukraine became independent in 1991, that relationship remained, well, let's just say complicated.
It wasn't just like a clean break, Independence Day, fireworks, and everyone's happy. The end.
No, not exactly.
Mm,
Um, think of it more like a messy divorce.
okay.
There's still baggage. And even within Ukraine itself, you have these varying degrees of national identity. Some regions feel closer to Russia, others fiercely identify as Ukrainian. That internal divide is a major factor in this whole conflict.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's 1991, Ukraine's independent, but things are tense.
Right.
Were there like any early warning signs that this could escalate into something bigger?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There were moments that kind of foreshadowed the current crisis.
Okay.
Take the Orange Revolution in 2004, for example.
Okay.
That was a huge pro-Western, pro-democracy movement within Ukraine. It showed that a significant portion of Ukrainians wanted to move away from Russia's sphere of influence.
Hmm.
And then, of course, there was Russia's intervention in Crimea in 2014,
Right.
which was a much more direct show of force.
Right. So it's like, hey, world, pay attention. This is serious.
Exactly. They exposed the fault lines in the relationship and laid the groundwork for what we're seeing today. To really understand the 2022 invasion, you have to see it as part of this larger pattern of tension and power struggles.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop, but what were the immediate triggers for the full-blown invasion in 2022? Was it all about NATO, or was there more to it?
NATO was definitely a major factor. For Russia, Ukraine aligning itself with the West, potentially joining the EU and NATO, that was a red line. They see Ukraine as this crucial buffer zone, a strategic chess piece that protects their western border.
Hmm.
But it wasn't just about NATO. The Donbass region in eastern Ukraine also played a big role.
Donbass, that's where those pro-Russian separatists were already fighting, right?
Right, they had been active there since 2014, backed by Russia.
Okay.
So you had this ongoing conflict simmering in the east, adding fuel to the fire. And then there were the Minsk agreements,
Right.
a series of ceasefires and political agreements that were aimed at ending the conflict in Donbass.
Okay.
They ultimately failed to bring about a lasting peace, which further escalated the situation.
So basically, it was a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And then February 2022, boom. I remember everyone was stunned by how quickly the invasion happened. What was the immediate global response?
The world reacted swiftly, primarily through economic sanctions.
Hmm.
The U.S., the EU, their allies, they all imposed severe sanctions on Russia, targeting their financial institutions, key industries, even individual oligarchs close to Putin.
Wow.
The goal was to cripple the Russian economy and pressure them to withdraw.
And did it work? Did those sanctions bring Russia to its knees?
Not exactly. The sanctions definitely had an impact, but the Russian economy proved more resilient than many anticipated.
So that's interesting. How did they manage to do that?
Well, they went all in on a few key strategies. They shifted their focus to Asian markets, particularly China and India, for energy exports.
Oh, okay.
They doubled down on domestic production, particularly for their military.
Okay.
And in a controversial move, they even expropriated foreign assets within Russia.
Whoa, wait, expropriating assets? That's a big deal.
Absolutely. It sent shockwaves through the international business community. It shows just how far Russia was willing to go to withstand the pressure.
Okay, so sanctions had an impact, but Russia found ways to adapt.
Right.
What about the broader strategic fallout from the war? It seems like it's reshaping the whole global landscape.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
On the one hand, the war has strengthened NATO. Countries that were once hesitant about military spending are now boosting their defenses. We even saw Finland and Sweden, historically neutral countries, decide to join NATO.
Right.
That's a huge shift, driven by the fear that Russia might not stop with Ukraine.
Yeah, so like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Russia's actions are pushing other countries closer to the West.
Exactly. On the flip side, though, the war has also pushed Russia and China closer together.
Oh, interesting.
They both see the West as a threat, and they're increasingly cooperating on economic and military matters. This new axis of power is a major development that could reshape the balance of power globally.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical buildup, the triggers for the invasion, the global response. But there's one thing I keep thinking about. Before the war, so many experts predicted a quick Russian victory. They thought Ukraine would crumble. Obviously, that didn't happen. What went wrong with those predictions?
Ah, the intelligence failures.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating case study in how even seasoned analysts can get things spectacularly wrong. A lot of it came down to misjudging both
It's
sides.
like, were they just looking at the wrong things?
Partly, they looked at Russia's military modernization, their combat experience in Syria, their sheer number of tanks and troops, and assumed that meant overwhelming force.
Okay.
But they underestimated the will of the Ukrainian people to fight for their country, and they overestimated the competence and morale of the Russian military.
So it was more than just bad intel. It was like a fundamental misreading of the situation.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that in complex situations like this, numbers and hardware don't tell the whole story. You
Right.
have to understand the human element, the motivations, the ideologies at play. And that's often much harder to quantify.
Speaking of the human element, I think it's important to pause here and just acknowledge the immense human cost of this war. It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics,
Right.
but at the end of the day, real people are suffering.
Absolutely. The numbers are staggering. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced, forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in neighboring countries. Cities have been reduced to rubble. And the psychological trauma, that's something that will linger long after the fighting stops.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And the long-term consequences of all this for Ukraine and the wider world, it feels impossible to predict.
You're right, there are so many unknowns. But there are a few potential scenarios we can explore, each with its own set of challenges and implications. One scenario is a negotiated settlement. Ideally, both sides come to the table, hammer out a deal, and the fighting stops. But realistically, getting there is a minefield.
Yeah, what are some of the biggest roadblocks to peace?
Well, there's a deep mistrust between Russia and Ukraine, for starters. Years of conflict, broken promises, accusations flying back and forth. It's hard to build trust on that foundation. And then there are the really thorny issues like territorial integrity.
Right.
Russia wants Ukraine to cede control of Crimea and recognize those separatist regions in the east. Ukraine understandably says, absolutely not.
So basically, they're starting from completely opposite positions. It
Yeah,
sounds
yeah.
like a recipe for deadlock.
It often feels that way.
Yeah.
And then you have the potential for spoilers, actors who benefit from the conflict continuing.
Okay.
That could be hardliners within Russia, certain political groups in Ukraine, even external forces with their own agendas.
Okay, so a negotiated settlement is a long shot. What are the other possibilities?
Another scenario is a protracted war. Imagine a stalemate where neither side can achieve a decisive victory, but the fighting grinds on for years, maybe even decades. It's a grim prospect with the constant drain on resources, lives lost, and the threat of the conflict suddenly escalating at any moment.
So kind of like a frozen conflict, but with much higher stakes because it's Russia and Ukraine.
Exactly. And that brings us to the most dangerous scenario, escalation. Imagine the conflict spilling over into neighboring countries or worse, drawing in NATO directly. It's a nightmare scenario, but it's one we can't ignore.
Especially with the nuclear weapons factor looming in the background. It feels like the risk of miscalculation is always there.
It's a constant worry. And it's why understanding the potential pathways to escalation is so crucial. One pathway is geographical, the conflict spilling over into a NATO country, whether by accident or design. Another pathway is through weapons, the potential use of chemical or even nuclear weapons, however unthinkable that might seem.
It's chilling to even think about. Okay, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the economic side of things. The sanctions on Russia were unprecedented. What's been the real impact on the global economy?
The ripple effects have been felt worldwide. One of the biggest impacts has been on energy markets. Russia's a major energy supplier, especially for Europe, so cutting off those flows caused a scramble to find alternatives. Prices skyrocketed, and we saw energy shortages in some places. It exposed just how reliant the world was on Russian energy.
So it's been a painful wake-up call for a lot of countries.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And then there's the impact on global supply chains.
Yeah.
The war disrupted the flow of goods, especially grain and fertilizer, which Ukraine is a major exporter of.
Right.
They contributed to food shortages and price increases, hitting developing countries the hardest.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even wars fought thousands of miles away can have a direct impact on what we see at the grocery store.
Right, and it's not just about the immediate economic fallout. The war has accelerated trends that were already underway, like deglobalization. Countries are now looking to reduce their dependence on potentially hostile powers for critical supplies,
Right.
even if it costs more.
So the war is sort of reshaping the way the global economy works, less interconnected, more regional.
That's one way to look at it. It's a shift away from the hyperglobalization we've seen in recent decades towards something more localized, more focused on self-sufficiency.
Okay, we've talked about the economic impact, but what about the human cost? Millions of Ukrainians displaced, cities destroyed. How are we even beginning to address the humanitarian crisis?
It's an immense challenge.
Yeah.
The international community has stepped up with aid, food, shelter, medical supplies,
Yeah.
but the needs are overwhelming. Neighboring countries, especially Poland, have taken in millions of refugees,
Right.
but that puts a strain on their resources too. And then there's the long-term trauma, particularly for children who've witnessed the horrors of war. Providing psychological support, helping people rebuild their lives, that's a long-term project.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of it. It makes all the political back and forth seem so insignificant.
It's a stark reminder that behind every headline, every statistic, there are real people whose lives have been shattered.
Let's talk about accountability for a moment. We've
Yeah.
seen images of atrocities, accusations of war crimes being committed. Is there any hope for justice?
The International Criminal Court, ICC, is currently investigating possible war crimes in Ukraine. It's a complex process, gathering evidence, building cases, and ultimately trying individuals. And there's a lot of debate about whether it's even possible to hold those at the very top, like Putin himself, accountable.
So even if crimes are proven, actually getting justice is a long shot.
It's definitely an uphill battle. But the pursuit of justice is important, even if it takes years or even decades. It sends a message that these crimes won't be tolerated, that there are consequences for those who violate international law.
It's a fight worth having, even if it's a long one. Okay, shifting gears again, let's talk about the information war. It feels like this conflict is being fought as much online as it is on the battlefield.
It absolutely is.
Okay.
This war has highlighted just how important the battle for narratives and perceptions is. Russia has a long history of using propaganda and disinformation, and they've been pushing their version of events hard, blaming the West, demonizing Ukraine, trying to control the story.
And how effectively has that been working?
It's been a mixed bag. Within Russia, where state media control is tight, the propaganda has been effective in shaping public opinion. But outside of Russia, they've faced more pushback. Ukraine has been savvy in using social media to get their message out, to show the world the reality of the war. And frankly, the brutality of the invasion itself has been hard for Russia to spin.
So, a case of reality biting back against the propaganda.
To some extent, yes, but it's still a constant struggle. The information battlefield is crowded and chaotic, and it's easy for misinformation to spread.
What does this mean for the average person trying to make sense of the news? How can we even tell what's real anymore?
It's tough, no doubt, but being aware of the information war is the first step. Don't just take things at face value. Check sources, look for multiple perspectives, and be wary of anything that seems too sensational or one-sided. Develop those critical thinking skills because they're more important than ever.
Okay, good advice. Now let's zoom out and talk about the long-term implications of this war. How is it reshaping global power dynamics? Is this the end of the world order as we knew it?
It's certainly a major turning point. For decades after the Cold War, the U.S. was the dominant global power. This war has challenged that dominance, showing its limits. We're seeing a shift towards a more multipolar world with centers of power emerging in Asia, the Middle East, and elsewhere.
So less U.S.-centric, more of a balance of power globally.
Exactly. And that means new alliances, new rivalries, a much more complex geopolitical landscape. The old playbook doesn't really apply anymore.
All right, let's talk specifically about Russia. What's the long-term outlook for them after this war?
They've paid a steep price, that's for sure. Economically, they're reeling from sanctions, facing isolation from the global financial system, and struggling to adapt.
Yeah.
Militarily, their reputation has taken a hit. They've suffered heavy losses, and the world has seen the limitations of their military capabilities. And politically, they've become increasingly isolated on the world stage.
So a lot of damage on multiple fronts. Is there any path back for them?
It's hard to say. A lot depends on how the war ends and on what happens within Russia itself.
Mm.
Will Putin remain in power? Will there be any internal push for change? Those are the big unknowns.
Okay, so Russia's future is uncertain. What about Ukraine? They've shown incredible resilience, but what will the long-term impact of this war be on them?
They've suffered immensely. There's no doubt about that. But there's also a sense that this war has forged a new national identity, a fierce determination to defend their country and their values. We see this incredible outpouring of international support for Ukraine, and that's likely to continue both during the war and in the long rebuilding process.
So a sense of hope mixed with the immense challenge of rebuilding.
Exactly. This war has been a defining moment for Ukraine, and it will shape their future for generations to come.
Okay, let's wrap up this section by talking about the global implications of this war. We've touched on some of them, but what are the biggest takeaways for the world as a whole?
This war has been a wake-up call for the international community. It's exposed vulnerabilities in the global order, shown the limits of deterrence, and highlighted the importance of alliances. It's also accelerated trends that were already underway, like the shift to renewable energy and the move towards a more multipolar world.
So a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty. What should we be watching for in the months and years ahead?
The big question is how the war will end and what the terms of any peace agreement might be. That will have a huge impact on everything else. We also need to watch how the relationship between Russia and the West evolves. Will it be a new Cold War? A tense standoff? Or will there be some attempt at rapprochement? And of course, we need to keep an eye on the rise of China and how they're navigating this new global landscape.
It feels like we're entering a new era, one that's much more complex and unpredictable than what came before.
I think that's a fair assessment. The old certainties are gone. We're in uncharted territory now.
Wow, yeah. It's a lot to think about. And, as we've been talking about, the consequences of this war really being felt all over the globe. But let's zoom in on Europe for a second. It feels like this conflict has been a real turning point for the whole continent.
Yeah, it's really shaken Europe to its core. For decades, the idea of a major land war in Europe seemed unthinkable. This conflict has shattered that sense of security and forced everyone to reassess their priorities.
So it's like a real wake-up call for European countries.
Absolutely. We're seeing a surge in defense spending all across Europe. Countries are scrambling to modernize their militaries, bolster their defenses. It's a recognition that they can no longer rely on the old security architecture. They need to be prepared for a much more dangerous and unpredictable world.
And what about the role of NATO? It seems like this war has really given the alliance a new sense of purpose.
It has. NATO has been revitalized by this conflict. Member states have reaffirmed their commitment to collective defense, and they've been providing substantial military aid to Ukraine. The war has shown just how important that transatlantic unity is in the face of a common threat.
So a renewed sense of solidarity within NATO. What about the European Union? How has the war impacted their role on the global stage?
The EU has really stepped up. They've imposed these unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia. They've been providing financial and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and they've taken in millions of Ukrainian refugees.
Yeah.
It's a real demonstration of European strength and resolve.
It sounds like the EU is becoming a much more assertive player in global affairs.
That's definitely something to watch.
Yeah.
The war has accelerated European integration, pushing the EU to take on a more prominent role in foreign policy and security matters. They're realizing that they can't afford to just sit on the sidelines anymore.
Okay, so big changes for Europe. But let's zoom in on one aspect of this conflict that I think is often overlooked. The role of public opinion. It's easy to get caught up in all the military and political analysis.
Right.
But ultimately, wars are won and lost by people.
You're absolutely right. Public opinion is a powerful force. It shapes the morale of the warring parties, influences the decisions of policymakers, and ultimately determines how any conflict will play out.
So what's the state of public opinion in Ukraine right now? I imagine it's pretty unified in support of the war effort.
It is. The Ukrainian people have shown incredible resilience, determination, and unity in the face of Russian aggression. They're fighting for their survival, for their freedom, for their very right to exist as a nation. And that shared sense of purpose is a powerful motivator.
And what about in Russia? It's harder to gauge given the control over the media. But is there any sign of dissent or opposition to the war?
It's difficult to say for sure, but there are cracks appearing in the facade. The economic hardship caused by the sanctions is starting to bite, and the high casualty rates are definitely causing unease.
Yeah.
There have been protests, albeit small and quickly suppressed. And the Kremlin's propaganda machine, while still powerful, is not as effective as it once was.
So there's some simmering discontent, even if it's not boiling over yet.
That's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
And then you have to consider the role of international public opinion, which has been overwhelmingly against Russia's actions. The global condemnation of the invasion, the support for Ukraine, the pressure on governments to take action, all of that matters.
Yeah, it seems like Russia has become a pariah state in the eyes of much of the world.
That's certainly the case in the West. And even countries that have tried to remain neutral are finding it increasingly difficult to just ignore the moral implications of this war.
Okay, so public opinion is playing a really significant role both within the warring countries and internationally. Now let's step back for a moment and think about some of the broader lessons that we can learn from this conflict. It's been a wake-up call for the world in so many ways.
It really has. This war has challenged so many of the assumptions we had about the post-Cold War world. It's exposed vulnerabilities in the global order, highlighted the limits of deterrence, and forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our own societies.
So what are some of the key takeaways, the things we need to be thinking about going forward?
Well, first and foremost, this war is a stark reminder that peace is fragile. We can't take it for granted. It requires constant effort, vigilance, and a willingness to defend it.
So complacency is dangerous.
Absolutely. We've seen what happens when we let our guard down, when we fail to address those root causes of conflict.
And what about the role of deterrence? It seems like that failed pretty spectacularly in this case.
It did. The threat of sanctions and military retaliation was clearly not enough to deter Putin from invading Ukraine. That raises some hard questions about the future of deterrence, particularly in an era of hybrid warfare and nuclear proliferation.
So we need to rethink how we deter aggression.
Yeah.
How do we make the costs of conflict so high that no rational actor would even consider it?
Exactly. And it's not just about military strength. It's about economic resilience, about information warfare, about building strong alliances. It's about a whole-of-society approach to national security.
So a more holistic approach to security, recognizing that threats can come from many different directions. What else should we be taking away from this conflict?
I think one of the most important lessons is the power of resilience. We've seen such incredible courage and determination from the Ukrainian people. They've refused to give up, they've fought back, and they've inspired the world with their resilience.
Yeah, so a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can prevail.
Absolutely. And that's a lesson we can all apply to our own lives, to the challenges we face, to the uncertainties of the future.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the historical roots of the Russia-Ukraine war, the geopolitical factors at play, the military dynamics, the economic consequences, the human cost, the potential outcomes, and the broader implications for the entire global order. It's a lot.
It's a complex and evolving situation with no easy answers.
But by really delving into this conflict, by examining the different perspectives and grappling with these tough questions, I think we can gain a much deeper understanding of this pivotal moment in history.
And hopefully, equipped with this knowledge, we can all contribute to a more informed and nuanced discussion about the war in Ukraine and its implications for the future.
We hope this deep dive has empowered you to form your own informed opinion on this incredibly multifaceted conflict.
And we encourage you to continue exploring this topic, to challenge assumptions, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to engage in constructive dialogue.
Because the stakes are high, and the search for peace is a journey that requires all of our collective effort.
The world is watching, and history will judge our actions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.